Welcome to the Baboom Baboom podcast, your go-to source for expert tips on car stereo installation, vehicle wiring, and all things wiring related. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started, we've got the advice to help you power up your ride. Get ready to crank up the volume on your knowledge and make your next wiring project a success.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know how much we love digging into the nitty-gritty of cars here, and today is no exception. We're doing a deep dive on something that's essential for DIYers, but also super interesting for anyone who just wants to understand their car better. Wire gauge.
It's one of those things, right? You might not think about it much, but it can make a huge difference in how your car performs. And even, safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure we've all had that moment where you flip on your headlights and your radio kind of dims for a second. Or maybe you've cranked up your sound system and thought, this doesn't sound as good as I thought it would. Wire gauge could definitely be the culprit there. I was actually checking out this article from Baboom Baboom. They always have solid advice, and it got me thinking we should break this down for our listeners.
Definitely a good call. It's something people get tripped up on all the time.
So let's get into it. For those who might be new to this whole world, what is wire gauge in the simplest terms?
So imagine a garden hose, right? You wouldn't use a fire hose to water your delicate flowers. You'd probably use something much smaller. Wire gauge is basically the same concept, but for electricity. It's all about the thickness of the wire, which tells you how much electrical current it can handle safely.
So a thicker wire is like a bigger hose. It lets more electrical water flow through without causing a problem.
You got it. And just like trying to force all that water through a tiny hose would cause trouble. Think bursting pipes trying to push too much electricity through a thin wire. Well, that's asking for trouble too.
Makes sense. And the article mentioned something about voltage drop too. How does that play into all of this?
Voltage drop, the silent killer of many a car electrical system. It's basically this. Think of your battery like a water tower. The further that water has to travel through the pipes you're wiring, the weaker the pressure gets by the time it reaches an end, right? That's voltage drop in a nutshell. And the thinner the wire, the more resistance there is, so the bigger that drop is going to be. It's like trying to water your entire garden with a single narrow hose. Some plants are going to be very unhappy.
Right. So if you have a long run of wire, say to a speaker in the back of your car, the signal is getting weaker the further it has to travel, especially if you've got a thin wire.
Exactly. And that's why choosing the right wire gauge is so important. It's about making sure that the electricity gets where it needs to go with enough force to actually do its job.
Now, I noticed in the Baboom Baboom article, they had this chart, super helpful, by the way, showing different wire gauges and what they're typically used for in a car.
Yeah.
But it's not as simple as just using one size fits all, is it?
Definitely not. You wouldn't use a fire hose for your delicate flowers or a tiny straw to fill up a swimming pool, right? It's all about matching the wire to the job.
So what are some examples? Like what kind of gauge would you use for, say, headlights versus something like, I don't know, those little LED lights people put in their cup holders?
Good example. So something small like LED accent lights, those can usually get away with a thinner wire, like a 22 gauge. But headlights, those are power hungry, so you'll need something thicker, probably a 14 or even 12 gauge, to handle that load without breaking a sweat.
And I'm guessing if you've got a serious sound system with amps and subwoofers, that's a whole other ballgame.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking some serious conductor size there, likely 12 gauge or even low. Remember, the lower the gauge number, the thicker the wire to handle all those amps without turning your electrical system into a meltdown.
Which is not the kind of meltdown we want. So the takeaway here is, if you're thinking about upgrading your car's sound system or really doing any kind of electrical work, understanding wire gauge is essential.
Couldn't agree more. It's about getting the performance you want, but also, and this is key, making sure your electrical system is safe.
And speaking of safety, the Baboom Baboom article didn't shy away from the dangers of using the wrong wire gauge.
Right.
And it's not just about things working poorly, right? We're talking actual hazards here.
Oh, absolutely. Using the wrong gauge can lead to all sorts of gremlins in your electrical system. Dim headlights, sluggish power windows, even damage to sensitive electronics, and it can be a fire hazard.
Wow, okay. So this is serious business. It's not just about getting the job done, it's about doing it right. Kind of like that old saying, a stitch in time saves 9. Or in this case, maybe a correctly sized wire saves a whole lot of electrical headaches.
Exactly. And speaking of getting it right, The article goes into some really great detail about installation tips, too, which are just as important as choosing the right gauge in the first place.
That's like you can pick the perfect size wire, but if your connections are iffy, it's all for nothing.
Need top-quality electrical wire? Baboom Baboom's got you covered. Get your 6-pack today. Each combo comes in 6 different colors and a total of 600 feet of wire. Perfect for any project, and you won't find a better price in the industry. Head over to baboombaboom.com now to snag yours. That's baboombaboom.com.
Exactly. It's like they were saying in the article about it being like a chain, only as strong as its weakest link.
Right. And they had some good tips in there about making sure those connections are solid, like what kind of connectors to use, making sure they're crimped or soldered properly, using heat shrink tubing to keep everything sealed up tight.
All about protecting those connections from the elements. Because, let's face it, under the hood of a car is not exactly a friendly environment for anything electrical. Heat, vibration, grease, grime. It's a war zone in there.
No kidding. So those wire looms they were talking about, those seem like a good idea, right? Keep everything organized and protected.
Wire looms are your friend. They make things look so much neater, too, which, let's be honest, under the hood organization is, well, it's usually not a priority for a lot of folks.
I'm guilty of that for sure. But, one thing the article mentioned that really stuck with me was about regular inspection.
Yeah.
It's easy to just button everything up and forget about it once you've done the work, but
But those wires aren't just sitting still under there. They're subjected to constant vibration, temperature changes, maybe even getting splashed with stuff now and then. Taking a few minutes every few months to give everything the once-over, check for any wear and tear, chafing, loose connections that can save you a world of trouble down the line.
think of it like checking your tire pressure, right? A little preventative maintenance goes a long way. Speaking of trouble, what about when things do go wrong? Electrical problems in cars always seem so mysterious to me.
Oh, they can be tricky for sure. But the Baboom Baboom article had some good advice about that too. Like, before you go down the rabbit hole of complex diagnostics, always check the simplest things first. Battery connections, for example. Are they tight? Are they free of corrosion? Something that simple can cause all sorts of weird electrical gremlins.
So true. It's easy to overthink it when sometimes it's the most obvious thing.
Exactly. And if you've checked the basics and you're still scratching your head, then you can start thinking about things like blown fuses, testing circuits with a multimeter.
Getting into the more advanced stuff.
Right. But the point is, having some basic knowledge about how car electrics work, and that's what we're all about here, right? It empowers you to at least attempt some troubleshooting yourself. And even if you end up taking it to a mechanic, you can have a more informed conversation with them.
Always better to be an informed consumer, especially when it comes to car repairs. Now, before we wrap things up, there was one thing in the Baboom Baboom article that I wanted to circle back to. They kept talking about 12-volt systems. So, does that mean everything we've talked about goes out the window if you're dealing with something that has a different voltage system, like, say, a hybrid or an electric vehicle?
That's a really important point, and you're right to bring it up. While the general principles of wire gauge and how much current a wire can handle, those stay the same, the specifics of what gauge to use, that can definitely change depending on the voltage of the system you're working with.
So for our listeners who might be used to tinkering with their trusty old gas-powered cars, don't just assume you can transfer that knowledge directly to something like rewiring something on a Tesla.
Let's just say you really don't want to make assumptions when it comes to high voltage systems. Those are a whole other ballgame. Always, always consult the manufacturer's specifications. And if you're in any doubt whatsoever, talk to a qualified technician who specializes in those systems. Safety first.
Good advice. Better safe than sorry, especially when you're talking about that much electrical power.
Well, this has been fascinating. I don't know about you, but I feel like we've learned a ton about wire gauge today. Who knew something as seemingly simple as the thickness of a wire could make such a big difference?
Right. It's like anything else with cars, the details matter. And it's often those little things that people don't think about until something goes wrong.
So true. But now, thanks to this deep dive, and of course that great article from Baboom Baboom, our listeners are armed with the knowledge they need to tackle their car electrical projects with confidence, or at least have a more informed conversation with their mechanic.
Always a good thing. The more you know, the better equipped you are to make good decisions about your car.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of being well-equipped, listeners, be sure to check out that full article on Baboom Baboom. It's got even more great info in there. Plus, they've got tons of other resources for all things automotive.
Definitely worth a look. Absolutely. And while you're at it, we'd love to hear from you. Head over to our social media pages. You can find all the links on our website and tell us about your experiences with car electrics. What have you tackled? What questions do you still have?
You never know. Your question might just spark our next deep dive.
That's right. So keep those questions coming. But for now, that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
And drive safely out there.
Need top-quality electrical wire? Baboom Baboom's got you covered. Get your 6-pack today. Each combo comes in 6 different colors and a total of 600 feet of wire. Perfect for any project, and you won't find a better price in the industry. Head over to baboombaboom.com now to snag yours. That's baboombaboom.com.